Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you guys doing? And welcome to this new session that we're going to be talking about deontological ethics in. What is this deontological ethics that we are talking about? We are going to discuss what deontological ethics is, especially in conjunction with its main proponent, which is Immanuel Kant, probably one of the most, if not arguably the most prolific Enlightenment philosopher that probably existed. But before we do all of that, we're going to read the poem and come back and explain it.
فصل الأخلاق الديئونثوليجية. الديئونثوليجية أخلاق كان لها من كنت انبثاق، فهو يرى السيئ من أفعال ما أوقع الناس على إفشال، فكل ما لو أن كل المجتمع فعله نجا فنهج يتبع، لكن ذا إلى الفساد ذاهب إذ إنه ما اعتبر العواقب.
Now, what we're going to do now is look at some of the things that Kant said. But before we go into that, it should be noted that in the liberal tradition, really, there are two main schools of thought. The first is, well, you could say two schools of thought which act as a basis for liberalism. First, as we've discussed last time, which is utilitarianism. J.S. Mill, we spoke about Jeremy Bentham, pain and pleasure, the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, that's one thing. The other thing is this deontological ethics, which in many ways is the opposite of utilitarianism. Very ironically, it's the opposite, and it forms the basis for many people of what constitutes what constitutes the base of liberalism. So actually it's important to note that in moral philosophy or in ethics, usually in the Western tradition it's divided into three different things. Okay, it's divided into deontological ethics, consequentialism, number two, and number three, virtue ethics. Okay, now we are not going to cover virtue ethics in any level of detail in this course. Virtue ethics is connected with Hellenistic philosophy, in particular Aristotle, who wrote a book on virtue ethics. Virtue ethics, just quickly, is about not prescriptive or descriptive even, it's to do with virtues, as it says on the tin. Okay, so it's about, for example, he would say there's like a Goldilocks zone. I mean, not this language, but a Goldilocks zone of not being too hasty, not being too brave, not being too cowardly, but being brave, and that's where the virtue is. It's about what kind of characteristics you have, rather than what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Whereas with both consequentialism and deontological ethics, it's about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Whereas for Aristotle and those who followed him, it was about how you should be rather than what you should do. But this how you should be rather than what you should do, although it sounds very nice, especially in self-development terms, it's not very applicable when it comes to legislation. I mean, you can't really put that into law. You can't translate that into law. Well, this is illegal, this is legal, this is right, this is wrong, and so on. And so because of that, it's not featured in the discourses in modern times as much as the other two have, which is consequentialism on the one hand, as I say, and deontological ethics, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Consequentialism or utilitarianism, which we've discussed already, which is the greatest good for the greatest number, is a form of consequentialism. Okay, is a form of consequentialism. It's very important. Consequentialism is the idea that what you do is based on, or the goodness or the badness of whatever you do is based on the consequences. So if I do something and it causes a lot of harm for people, that consequence is a bad consequence, and therefore morality will be based on whether the bad is more than the good or the good is more than the bad. And that is, utilitarianism obviously is an extension of that. It's saying the greatest good for the greatest number, and we want to minimize the most pain for the most people. Now, deontological ethics says, deontological ethics it says no. It says this is not how we should base our morality. We should base our morality on something referred to as goodwill. Okay, we're not doing it because of its consequences. We're doing it because it's good in and of itself. It has intrinsic value. So on the one hand, consequentialism, utilitarianism, or utilitarianism, which is consequentialist, has what you call instrumental value. Okay, instrumental value. Whereas deontological ethics says, no, it's intrinsic value. I'm doing it not because of the consequences, but because it's good in and of itself. Okay. Now, obviously, as you're thinking here, where do we stand on the issues as Muslims? Are we consequentialist, or are we deontological? And just to put it out there, and it will come to that in the poem. But we're neither or. We're both. Okay, this is the answer. We say that there are some times where being consequentialist is the right thing to do, and other times where being consequentialist is not the right thing to do, and doing something for the sake of doing it is the right thing to do. And we will see why taking one of the two and not incorporating the other, whilst it solves a lot of problems, creates a lot of problems as well. So, just if you look at the third slide here, you'll see some of the books, okay, that were written. So, Immanuel Kant wrote a book called Groundwork of the Metaphysics of the Moral in 1785. Now, Jeremy Bentham, who we've discussed already, we discussed he was the mentor of J.S. Mill, who wrote the book on utilitarianism, which basically acted as the basis for the dominant ethic of today, which is the liberal ethic. He wrote his book, Introduction to the Principle of Moral Legislation, 4 years later. Obviously, he had other works before that. But you can see there's a conversation that's being had between them, and they're clearly aware of each other's work. So these are competing ideas, okay? And not only are they competing when we look in hindsight back, no, actually they were competing with each other as it stands. Like they knew of each other's works and stuff like this. So we talked about this already, that unlike utilitarianism, the theory starts with the principle of goodwill. And what you need to understand is Kant's supreme morality. This is what he said, okay? So I'm going to read it out exactly in his words, and we can think about it a little bit. Maybe we can speak to the person next to us. He says this: act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature. So what is he saying? He's saying your actions, you have to imagine, had everyone done what I am doing, would this be good or bad? Which in many ways, and even though it's against utilitarianism in some senses, in many ways is similar to it, because you're still looking at the aggregate, aren't you? You're still looking at the end result. But in direct terms, it's not utilitarianism, because we're not looking at the direct consequences in peer groups and society. We're looking at the overall, we're looking macro straight away. And that's why some have said, actually this is a form of utilitarianism, but it's called rule utilitarianism. So they divide utilitarianism to two things: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, and they refer to this as rule utilitarianism. So in a sense, in an ironic kind of sense, it is a type of utilitarianism, even though it's against the reasoning of utilitarianism, which is we look at the consequences. He says, no, we don't look at the consequences. We're doing it for the sake of doing it. And that's uncompromising. Okay, it's very uncompromising. We're going to see how uncompromising it is. So he gives 4 examples, and we're going to, so before we get there, so you might have heard some apologetics in Islam, someone ask about the polygamy situation. Why is polygamy allowed in Islam? And you might have heard from Zaki Naik or Ahmed Didat or these kinds of people. You say, well, look, there's more women than there are men in the world. And if all the men got married and all the women got married, then there'll be more men than women. So there's a problem. So what kind of reasoning is he using? He's actually using a Kantian reasoning, if you think about it, right? Now, should he be using a Kantian reasoning? I mean, that's a question for another day. But the point is, there are limitations we're going to come to see of this Kantian reasoning, okay? Do we believe in Kantian reasoning in all of the things in Islam? Certainly not, okay? There are some things which have nothing to do with that, and we can show easy examples of this. But let's move on. So Kant mentions 4 things. And he mentions more than 4 things, but 4 main things, which he states are, if everyone did it, if everyone did this, it would be an impossible state of affairs. It would be an impossible state of affairs. And therefore, it's not just a matter of the consequences, it's a matter of impossibility. Like the society would be unrunnable had these things been put in place. And the first thing he mentions is false promises. If everyone gave everyone false promises, then society would not function. It would be an impossible state of affairs. And that's true to many extent. We don't disagree with this. I mean, there are some things that if everyone done, that there would be a problem. They say an eye for an eye makes the whole world go blind. That's not true. It would make everyone have one eye, by the way. monocular vision. It's not. They wouldn't ever, because blindness would require both eyes to be. Anyway, so this is false. Even if you think about it, just logically, these expressions, sometimes you think about them just with a bit of criticality, and everything falls apart. But the point is, the idea is, if everyone done it, what would happen? If everyone gave each other false promises, what would happen? If everyone committed suicide, and he gives a third thing. He talks about untapped talent. Like if you have a talent and you don't explore your talent, well, if everyone who had a talent didn't explore their talent, what would happen? You'd have a talentless society, And he gives, by the way, interestingly, he gives the example of suicide as the fourth example as well. Now, before we go any further, I want you to speak to the person next to you, and let's talk about the merits of this, and think about the demerits of it as well. Like, okay, you're already starting to think, this is what he's saying, if everyone done it. That's basically what he's saying. What can you think of are the merits and the demerits of this particular moral philosophy? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes, and then we'll come back and talk to each other. There was a book written by Machiavelli. I'm not sure if anyone's read it. It's a Prince, and it was written by Machiavelli it was advice to princes, to rulers, and how to rule a country. And it's the premise of the book, if you want to put it that way, is the ends justify the means. Do whatever it takes to get the job done. Very pragmatic approach, very let's get the job done approach. So he'll say things, I'm not, word for word, but you use as much love as possible to get them to love you. And if that fails, get them to fear you, things like that, And some of it, obviously, is very practical advice. But you can, if you go too far in that direction, as we'll see today, it can lead to catastrophic outcomes. You can justify all kinds of killing and you can do a lot of things. But before we get to those examples, let's talk about deontological ethics, which is the opposite of consequentialism, which says the ends never justify the means. It's about the aggregate total and the universalizing principle. What are some of the merits, Ahmad?
We're thinking about the problems with it.
Let's think about the merits first. Let's try and.
Just truthful society. If you universalize the truthfulness and everybody's telling the truth, then you get rid of 90% of the world's problems probably. So that's
So things like corruption.
Yeah, a noble thing to do.
Yeah. You can see why that can be a really good thing.
Yeah, it also addresses some of the problems with the utilitarianism, like, for example, gang rape and things like that.
Yes.
Some of the obvious examples, the problems with consequentialism.
Yes. Good point. Anything else? It's a good point that you said that it addresses a lot of the problems of consequentialism. Obviously, the opposite can also be said, but we'll come to this. Any other points? What's the strength of this theory? Look, just think about one of the examples that we talked about, untapped talent. That's a really good way of putting it, isn't it? He's basically immoralizing or demoralizing the idea of someone not using their talent, and he's saying it's not good, because if everyone did that, we would have what kind of society? A talentless society. If you think about it, that's a very powerful thing to think. It's a very powerful way of putting it, And it's efficient economically. You can see the merits in this, no? Can you see the merits in this? Any other merits before we move on?
More fair society, I think.
Yes.
More fair.
You can get more fair society out of it, depending on how the society is in the first place. But potentially, it depends on what society is in the first place. Anything else? Anything from your side? Not really. Oh, what about the demerits? So some of the. Yeah, you're ready now, yeah?
It seems to run into paradoxes sometimes. For example, if you take the universalizing principle, so if everyone becomes a doctor according to the principle, it would be a society wouldn't function, because we need drivers, teachers, and everybody else. So therefore, according to that principle, becoming a doctor should be immoral. But then if nobody becomes a doctor, then that also is not desirable.
Right. So it's funny enough, because there's a book that you should read on this, beginner book, by Jonathan Wolfe. Jonathan Wolfe. He's actually got a book on moral philosophy. I think it's called Moral Philosophy. It's very easy to read, and he actually mentions this exact example. He mentions, in fact, the carpenter example. If everyone were to become a carpenter. But then he says, look, this Immanuel Kant, this is what Jonathan Wolfe is saying. He says Immanuel Kant would say this is not a very good interrogation. And the reason why is because the universalizing principle here is not that everyone should be a carpenter or a doctor. The universalizing principle is that everyone should do the profession that they are best at. Do you see the point? You see, and see that is a good response to that refutation. So we have to get stronger now. We have to become more powerful. We'll get stronger, especially when. Do you want to say anything?
But isn't he arbitrarily applying that principle then, the universalizing principle?
There's why is it arbitrary? Explain to me why it's arbitrary.
Yeah. Why can he apply it in that way, which is like everybody should?
He's saying that if society were to act in X way X, yeah, and if that's universalized, and if that thing which is being universalized makes society impossible to run, like everyone lying to each other or contracts not being fulfilled or promises, then that thing should be outlawed. It's a strong argument, and we need something stronger than this to refute it.
By everybody just telling the truth, it would be also chaotic, in a sense of like sometimes you have to hide some. I
like this. This is a very good point. But we'll get some good examples of this. Have you got any examples of this?
Yeah, for instance, if you ask me something that I don't want to answer, in the sense of.
No, but he will say if you don't want to answer it. And not answering it is not lying about it.
Yeah, but
okay, we'll come to this, right? Let's not jump the gun. Okay, we'll come to this. In fact, that was something he brought up himself. Someone comes to the house, but we can have stronger examples.
We can mention wife and husband, so many relations that.
No, that is true.
You know,
and just for the sake of 10b here, reminder, there is a hadith on this. لا يحل الكذب إلا في ثلاث. That lying is not allowed except for 3 things. But we'll come to what those 3 things are afterwards.
He says that there's some things like lying. Does he say that it's always wrong?
Yes, and we'll come to that. We'll come to that. All right, let's move on to this. Lying is always wrong for him. There is never, and he's very clear about that. There's no second interpretation. And lying, you can never tell a lie. You know, and why? Because it's not about the consequences. It's universalized, you've made it into a moral, and therefore you can't lie. Okay, let's move on. We talked about, he's interesting, and he's a genius. You can't mock him, because you have to deal with him. You know, you really do have to deal with him. This guy's not a joke. You can't just come and say, well, I've got the example that's going to finish him. You have to think deeper if you want to finish this guy. First and foremost, he has some really interesting examples. He says sometimes you can have virtues, yeah? Like self-control is a virtue, right? But he goes, those virtues are sometimes not good to have in certain contexts. And he gives the example of a self-controlled criminal. And look what he says. I found this fascinating. It's very interesting, to be honest. He goes, the coolness of a scoundrel makes him far more dangerous. The coolness of a scoundrel makes him far more dangerous, because he's saying a chaotic scoundrel, like someone who's like a scoundrel, right? A ruffian, you know, a thug. But if he's chaotic, he gets caught quickly. His emotions run high. He doesn't think. But the ones who's cool and calculated and sit down with his friends and plan the heist and this and that and going into the bank, this guy's a dangerous one, because he's calculated, he's systematic, he's Machiavellian. You know, maybe some films there you're thinking about. Is it called The Heist? Is that the film? It's called Heat, yeah? Is there a film called The Heist? There is a film called The Heist, you know. So these are cool-headed scoundrels right there. Obviously. And by the way, the cool-headed scoundrels are always seen in a different way in I think, theatre and movies. Sometimes they're even the protagonist. Like there was a series, it's called Breaking Bad or something. And this guy, he's a scoundrel. The main guy, what's his name? Yeah, so he's a scoundrel basically. He's a cool-headed scoundrel, and he's thinking about this and that. And by the way, this guy, he's portrayed as Machiavellian. He's exactly Machiavellian. You know, he's portrayed as like he'll do the ends justify the means in any situation. He's a consequentialist, you know. So Kant would have a few words to say about him. But before we get in there, I think we need to get some key terms out of the way, yeah? So there are two important key terms when we're dealing with Kant and we're dealing with deontological ethics that we need to be familiar with, okay? The first of the two key terms is that which is referred to as hypothetical imperatives, okay? And the second of the key terms is categorical imperatives. And I'll explain the difference between the two. A hypothetical imperative is when you say, if you study, for example, I'm giving you an example, right? If you study, you'll be successful. So it's prudential in nature, okay? It's telling you that if you do X, then Y result would occur. If you go to the barber, you can get a haircut. Maybe that's not a great example. If you jog, you'll get fit, yeah? Something like that. And so it's a hypothetical imperative. It doesn't really have a moral value judgment there. It's just saying that if you do this, such and such result would come about. So it's prudential in nature, and a prudence. Prudence is your ability, your competence, your ability to do something and get something done. It's not saying this thing is good or bad, okay? Whereas the word categorical imperative is moral now. And when we say categorical, when we say Kant's categorical imperative, we are talking about the universalizing principle, the maxim that we've just spoken about. Right? So the prudential thing, sorry, the hypothetical imperative is not moral, whereas when we talk about categorical imperatives, that is moral now. So it is, on his, let's put it in religious language, it's haram to lie for him in every circumstance. It's wrong. It's haram for you to not fulfill your talents. It's haram to commit suicide. It's haram not to keep your promises. I mean, for the most part, these are actually haram anyway, for the most part. But we do have some significant exceptions. And here again, we have some of these examples. Now, what I want you to do, let's pause it again. And these are 4 examples, okay? And before we get to the problems of the ontological ethics, we're all itching. How do we refute this guy? He seems he's coherent now. He seems very strong. And this is basically, I would say, the best the West has to offer. Genuinely, this is it's the gold standard Western thing. Immanuel Kant this is the reason why he's celebrated, because his whole enterprise was, let me try and get morality outside of religion. And this is what he got. You can see already how it competes with utilitarianism and how it provides answers for some of the problems. But we'll come to the problems of this, of deontological ethics. Before we do that, let's think about it. You've got 4 things which he mentions: suicide, neglecting your talents, false promises, and refusing to help others. That's 4 things, yeah? Speak to the person next to you for the next 3 minutes about those 4 things and tell me what you think about them. Why you think he's saying that, where you think any paradoxes may be, where you think any contradictions may lie, what are the merits and demerits of highlighting those 4 points in his categorical imperative. Yeah, 3 minutes, and then we'll come back.
Was he religious himself?
There's a whole discussion about whether he is religious, he has Christian background, or, I mean, I'd have to look at the literature. I don't think he's known to attack some of the arguments for God's existence, the cosmological arguments, the ontological arguments.
Yeah.
Did he make a moral argument himself? Some claim that he made a moral argument for God's existence. Because a lot of this, why is there morality, how, you know, and so on. Some of it is, he would say, it's a priori. We know morality a priori is something which is in the mind. This is like you're starting off with it.
Was he the one that said that quote about, like, you know, you have to put aside reason to make room for God or something?
I'm not sure if that's an exact quote, but yeah, basically something like that. Yeah, yeah. No, his whole project was he's trying to get a moral structure outside of religion.
In spite of his potential religiosity.
Yeah. In spite of that, yes.
Kant came after David Hume, right? He was inspired by him.
Yes.
Even in terms of Hume's discussion.
Wait, let me make sure of that.
Yeah, he did. I
Yeah.
read about it like yesterday.
Okay.
I think there's a discussion about whether David Hume was an atheist himself as well.
He was an atheist.
Yeah.
There's actually a discussion on it. Some people say no.
Yeah?
Yeah. Some say he was like a secular Christian.
Yeah, he came after. He came after, like you
Yeah, I
said.
think,
But
Kant
they
said-
were both in the 1700s.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think Kant about him said he took me out of my darkness or something along those
Yeah,
lines.
yeah. All right, let's 3 minutes. Those 4 examples again. So who's got a first contribution on this side and the left side? Before I pick someone up.
Refusing to help other people.
Yes.
If it was universalized, then you could have people helping those who have bad intentions.
That's
So
a really
you-
good point.
You can have a criminal who would ask you for help.
Yes.
So give me the maps of the bank,
Right.
and then if you refuse to help him, then
Yes.
that's a paradox as well.
That is a very good point. That is a good point. If you're refusing to help other people, then what kind of people are we talking about? You're refusing to help criminals, refusing to help others. In some cases, it will make more sense than others. Like, for example, doctors have an obligation not to refuse treatment to anybody who comes into the hospital, and you can understand that. But when you talk about, like you've just said, these examples that you've just used, it's an entirely different kettle of fish. Any other examples on this side?
One of the things we spoke about was that, I don't know, it seems like there's like a root assumption here that it's better for society to function than for it not to function. Because if you're trying to make an ethical system basically from, I don't know, without religion or without reference to God or whatever,
Yes, yes.
all of these things is saying that, you know, if these things are universalized, it'll be impossible for society to function. And he mentions all of these things, but he hasn't actually said why it's better for
That's
society
good.
to function than for
That
it
is a
not to
very good.
function.
It's a true point. And you know, do you know who refutes him on this? John Mackey refutes him on this in his book Ethics. He has a book called Ethics, and he spends a considerable chunk of his time, just refuting him on this. And he mentions why universalize anyway. Like, well, you haven't provided any justification for it. And he starts giving possible reasons why someone would want to universalize a principle. One of them is empathy, which we'll actually have a whole session on, just empathy by itself, which Paul Bloom actually wrote a book called Against Empathy. Very interesting. But why are we universalizing in the first place, and what justification do we have to universalize? This is a very good point. How did we get from a description to a prescription? And you now have the same issue that we had with utilitarianism. How do we justify the premise, which is that in fact there should be a universalization, there should be a categorical imperative, that it should be functional? Why shouldn't there be anarchy?
Can we ask why is lying wrong?
Pardon?
For instance, can we ask why lying is wrong?
Yeah, even that. Yeah. No, but he'll give you an answer for that.
Yeah.
His answer is, okay, if so, why is lying wrong? What would he say about this?
Doesn't allow society to function.
It's
Right.
universal good.
Right? Because if everyone done it, what would happen?
Yeah, the truth society.
You would have an impossible society.
Oh.
You see, because if everyone's lying to each other, you can't sell, you can't buy, you can't marry, you can't transact. If society was based, and that's to a large extent, that's actually a very strong argument. But we'll move on to the problems of deontological ethics, and lying is, I think, the best example to use, because he mentions lying, and obviously he's, in all cases, against lying. And in his book, on a supposed right to lie because of philanthropic concerns, he says, what if a man comes to the house? Okay, the woman is there, and these guys are, I don't know, gangsters, military men, whatever they may be, yeah? Where's your husband? And obviously they want to come in and kill him. If she says, yeah, he's just in the front room. All right, cool. Come inside and shoot him, kill him. Or that was the example. He said, no, in that situation, she shouldn't lie. She should tell the truth.
Does he say alternate truths then?
No. He doesn't say any of that. He says it is immoral for her to lie. He doubles down on that. And then he gets criticized and smashed to pieces because of this. And this is where consequentialism becomes a bit more alluring. But the question is, why would it be alluring? Because is there inconsistency there somewhere? Well, let's think about it. Is one of his universalizing principles surely is that you don't want people to die, right? In a society that, you know, the murder is wrong. So if murder is wrong and that's a universalizing principle, then what causes murder, I mean, should be wrong, essentially. But he will say no, because there's now a conflict of universalizing principles. So you can have one universalizing principle which the consequences of which will contradict another universalizing principle, and there's nothing he can do about it, and it's just a limitation of his system. Yes.
Could you say like, I'm going to kill myself, and then if you don't, then you're lying? Is that a contradiction?
I'm going to kill myself.
Yeah, and then obviously lying is wrong. So
No, if you're talking about lies which are not straight-faced lies, which are speaking in forked tongues and stuff.
now if you say like, I'm going to kill myself, but obviously lying is wrong, right?
Yeah.
So why would you do that scenario on Kantian ethics?
I'm going to kill myself.
Because killing
Yeah.
yourself is wrong as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
So it's a contradiction, isn't it? So
if I'm going to kill myself. No,
Yeah.
what would be wrong here is killing himself. If you mean
would you choose to lie, or would you choose to kill yourself in that scenario on Kant's?
no, but if he say I'm going to kill myself, he's telling the truth, right? There's no
Oh,
problem there.
If you say, or if you say I'm not going to kill myself.
Well, that's fine. That's
Okay.
just him telling the truth about his
Okay.
state. There's no issue there.
Yeah.
The issue is, now we've said, okay, yes, go ahead.
Go to example. For example, let's say he's held at gunpoint. And then this guy says, "Okay, I'll do it myself. I'll kill myself." Right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what he's getting to. So if he was lying there, and he was saying that just to escape, that still would be wrong against from his standpoint. But if he does go and kill himself, it'd be still wrong as well.
Yeah. No, yeah, but you're telling me about implementation here. I'm telling you about the theory, right? I'm saying to you, look, in and of itself, there's issues here. If you do thing A, which is in this case, tell the man where your husband is so you can get killed, yeah, it's going to lead to his death. If it leads to his death is murder. One of your other universalizing principles was that murder is wrong. So the consequences of not abiding by, of obeying universalizing principle A, was that it contradicted one of the objectives of universalizing principle B, and there's nothing you can do about it. But then we can have stronger examples of this. Instead of just someone coming in, so we've got a child, a 1-year-old child, and if you don't tell me this, I'm going to rape the child, and if you don't do this, we can make it more gruesome. And on his ethic, you'd have to rape the child. You'd have to let the child get raped. You'd have to get nuclear weapons. We can get less. If you don't do this, lying could save a nuclear attack. You can imagine that. So actually, if there's a nuclear attack, what's the point of a universalizing principle if there's no one for it to be implemented on, right? You see, so this is why the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he told us, right, don't lie, and these things. But he says, لا يحل الكذب إلا في ثلاث. He also said this, that you're not allowed to lie except for in 3 situations. And there are more. These are just 3 he mentioned. Obviously, we know life and death is always an excuse. It's always an excuse in Islam. But also, for the partners, for the spouses. And by the way, it's both ways. Someone says, oh, this is sexist and feminist. Well, I say, listen, even on your paradigm, we're saying a man to a woman and a woman to a man. It's both ways, it's like that. If a man, sometimes you're going to, imagine if partners were sitting in the house telling the truth about what they thought. Okay, like, just imagine, this is like a comedy sketch, yeah? Sitting down, well, did you think my friend looked good? Yeah, you look amazing today, yeah? did you think this? And then they just talk about this and that. Who was better, me or your ex-husband? No, the ex-husband was actually better. And so on and so forth. What would that do to relationships? It would destroy them. And the other thing is to try and reconciliate between 2 people. So Islam says if you have 2 friends and you can give them a little white lies, this and that, just to bring them back together, because the ends justify the means here. And the third and most controversial one, actually is completely uncontroversial, is al-harb khida', that war is deception. Imagine being in war, okay, and telling your enemy, so where have you put the bomb? I put it in coordinates. You're going to lose every war. That's why you need Machiavelli. You don't need Immanuel Kant here. You need Machiavelli. If you go to war, we'll have a football manager. We have a football manager. Forget about war. We have a football manager. Who's it going to be? Immanuel Kant, who's going to give away all the formations and stuff like that? Or we're going to have Machiavelli. I think everyone will choose Machiavelli. Or Sir Alex Ferguson, or whoever it may be. The point is that consequentialism makes sense in some areas. But by the way, Islamically, there are some areas where there's never a consequential reason. For example, if somebody said, rape your daughter, otherwise we'll kill you. He can't say, well, it's life or death, I have to rape her. it's basically all scholars say that he has to take the shot, because you can't defile somebody else's rights in this dimension or in this domain of taking their sexual rights like that, especially through rape and stuff. You cannot do it. So if someone says, and so therefore consequentialism is out the window here. Consequentialism is out the window, because consequentialism would mean that you can do lots of things. You can go very far, you know. So there we would side with Kant, but other places we would side with Mill, and that's why we believe in the middle path. Now, there are other examples of this, but what we are going to do is conclude this session today. I think we've covered some very important points. We've seen some of the strengths, and there have been some considerable strengths of this theory, moral theory, but there are some considerable weaknesses as well. I think we've seen that. And likewise with consequentialism and utilitarianism, we've seen some of the strengths. Okay, the greatest good for the greatest number, you know, all that stuff, but also some of the weaknesses, you know. And in the next session, we're going to be going into more details about some of those strengths and weaknesses, and going into more of these things. But if you understand, okay, if one understands that the Western philosophy, Western moral philosophy, ethics, is these three things: consequentialism, I mean, obviously it's more, but mostly it's somehow subcompartmentalized under one of these three things: consequentialism, deontological ethics, which we've talked about today, and thirdly, virtue ethics, which is not really in use. Then you've understood a lot. You have actually understood a lot, and so you'll be able to connect the dots. You'll be watching a film and you think, oh, that's consequentialist ethics. You'll be watching maybe you shouldn't be watching these kind of films anyways, but you'll be seeing something or on the news or this and that, someone reasoning something. Oh, this is wrong because. And you'll realize that most of the time, they'll bring about a justification which is either deontological or consequentialist. Like honestly, 90% of the time, that's what they're going to do. They'll bring about a justification which is, it's wrong because it causes this consequence, the consequences of the action. Or it's wrong because it is just wrong, intrinsically wrong. You've covered a lot there. But both of those things have problems. And if you say, if that's what you believe in, then you have to justify this, that, and the other. And in conversation, this makes you a very difficult person to deal with. But we don't want you to be a very difficult person on the loved ones and the close ones, but only on the enemies and the, and the antagonistic ones. And with that we conclude. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alright, so let's do a discussion. We're going to have one consequentialist camp.